I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, I'm going to be reading an op-ed piece from Ezra Klein from the New York Times here in June of 2022, particularly bold example of really bad sense-making and really bad science communication and parenting in stressful times communication. Very strong opinions about Ezra Klein, and there will be 3 or 4 other authors that I will bring on in similar fashion in this series during June of 2022. Hey there, everybody. This is kind of a special session of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I've really been loath to read articles and doom scroll and so on, but I'm making an exception in this case, even though one of my favorite chroniclers of the doomosphere, Hambone Littletail, Sam Mitchell, recently covered this briefly. I just mentioned it and read a couple of paragraphs. I'm going to take it to greater length because I think this is the start of a 3 or 4 episode series that I'd like to offer about some of the troubles of both sense making and also just getting along with one another when we're really close on the spectrum of really giving a damn about what's going on in the environment, in the world, and so on. There's just a lot of really garbage sense making going on, and really poor communication. And then in some of the later episodes after this one, we're going to see how it actually gets into cancel culture and pretty nasty. This is not one of the nastier ones, but this is, I think, a pretty good example of really sloppy communication and sloppy sense making. And unfortunately, it's all in the name of trying to make some sort of point about how important it is to have kids, even though the times are particularly tragic and not looking good for the future. So this is an article from the New York Times. It's from an opinion piece from Ezra Klein from June 5th of this year. Your kids are not doomed. Over the past few years, I've been asked one question more than any other. It comes up at speeches, at dinners, in conversation. It's the most popular query when I open my podcast to suggestions time and again. It comes in 2 forms. The first, should I have kids given the climate crisis they will face? The second, should I have kids knowing they will contribute to the climate crisis the world faces? And it's not just me. A 2020 Morning Consult poll found that a quarter of adults without children say climate change is part of the reason they didn't have children. The Morgan Stanley analysis found that the decision not to have children owing to fears over climate change is growing and impacting fertility rates quicker than any preceding trend in the field of fertility decline. One thing I've noticed after years of reporting on climate change, the people who have devoted their lives to combating climate change keep having children. I hear them playing in the background of our calls. I see them when we Zoom. And so I began asking them,
Why? Quote, I unequivocally reject scientifically and personally the notion that children are somehow doomed to an unhappy life, says Kate Marvel, a climate scientist and science communicator at Columbia. To bring a child into this world has always been an act of hope. The past was its own parade of horrors. The best estimates we have suggest that across most of human history, 27% of infants didn't survive their first year, and 47% of people died before puberty. And life was hard, even when you were lucky enough to live it. As Dylan Matthews writes at Vox, what today we'd characterize as extreme poverty was, until a few centuries ago, the condition of almost every human on Earth. In 1820, some 94% of humans lived on less than $2 a day. Over the next 2 centuries, extreme poverty fell dramatically. In 2018, the World Bank estimated that 8.6% of people lived on less than $1.90 a day, and the gains were not solely economic. Before 1800, average lifespans didn't exceed 40 years anywhere in the world. Today, the average human life expectancy is more like 73. No mainstream climate models suggest a return to a world as bad as the one we had in 1950, to say nothing of 1150. Was the world so bad for virtually the entirety of human history that our ancestors shouldn't have made our lives possible? If not, then nothing in our near future looks so horrible that it turns reproduction into an immoral act. I worry writing this that it will be taken as a dismissal of the suffering climate change will unleash. It's not. An appreciation of how bad our past was should deepen our fury at how recklessly our future is being treated. We've done so much to build a seawall between us and the pitiless world. We've done so much to make the future better than the past. To give back any portion of those gains, or even to prevent the progress we could otherwise see, is worse than a tragedy. It's a crime. But that, and not apocalypse, is the most likely path we're on. This, strange as it is to say, is progress. As Zeke Housefather, a climate scientist, notes, many credible estimates from a decade ago put us on track for the average global temperature to increase 4 or even 5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels by 2100. That would be cataclysmic. But the falling cost of clean energy and the rising ambition of climate policy have changed that. The Climate Action Tracker puts our current policy path at about 2.7 degrees of warming by 2100. If the commitments world governments have made since the Paris Climate Accord hold, we're on track for a rise of 2 degrees or even less. There's still more reason for optimism. One of the truly thrilling papers I've read in recent years carried the plodding title, Empirically Grounded Technology Forecasts and the Energy Transition. The authors looked at more than 2,900 forecasts for how fast the cost of installing solar power would fall from 2010 to 2020. The average prediction was 2.6% annually. No prediction was over 6%. But solar power costs actually fell by 15% per year. Other technologies have seen similar drops in costs. If these curves hold in the future, and they could well steepen if backed by better policy, then we are even now underestimating the possible path of progress. But hope is not a plan, and no one should mistake 2.5 degrees of warming or even 2 degrees for success. We will have caused incalculable damage to ecosystems. We will have worsened droughts, flood, famines, heat waves. We will have bleached coral reefs, acidified the ocean, driven countless animal species to extinction. Millions, maybe tens of millions of people will die from increased heat, and more will be killed by the indirect consequences of climate change. Far more yet will be forced to flee their homes or live lives of deep poverty or suffering. We will have stolen the full possibility of their flourishing from them. All of that, though, also describes the world we inhabit, not just the world we're creating. Climate models force us to confront vast expanses of future suffering that, if they were ongoing around us, we might fail to see. As my colleague David Wallace Wells, a father of two and the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, as well as a must-read newsletter, wrote to me, what looks like apocalypse in prospect often feels more like grim normality when it arrives in the present. Oof. This is no mere abstraction or prediction. The evidence that we ignore mass suffering is all around us. We are ignoring it right now, just as we did yesterday and just as we will tomorrow. An estimated 20 million people died of COVID, and now we're over it. What do we make of that? Wallace Wells wrote to me, 10 million people a year are dying of air pollution. What do we make of that? And what does it tell us about climate change, which is quite unlikely, as I wrote in my big piece on pollution, to ever kill as many as now die from particulates? This reflects a facet of our climate future that conversations about the life prospects of well-off children in the United States obscure. It's true that climate change will affect both the rich and the poor. It is not true that it will affect them equally. Wealthy Californians breathing in wildfire smoke are not facing the suffering of poor Bangladeshis whose homes lie in the path of cyclones. Even a world with 2 degrees of warming is a world in which we will have looted the future of billions of people to power a present we preferred. And not we as in all human beings, we as in the rich countries that are responsible for the vast majority of the greenhouse gases trapped in our atmosphere. It's true that China has recently become the largest emitter, but we dwarf the Chinese cumulatively and continue to emit far more per person. The people who are least responsible for climate change are the most affected by it. Marvel told me, that's Kate Marvel, as mentioned before. I'm struggling to find appropriate academic language to describe this, but I keep ending up at, that's wrong. It's simply morally wrong. Climate change is and will be an engine of global inequality. Richer people and countries will buy their way out of the worst consequences, often using wealth accumulated by burning fossil fuels. The fear about the future our children will face when voiced by well-off residents of wealthy countries sometimes strikes me as a transference of guilt into terror. To face what we've done to others is unimaginable. It's easier somehow to imagine we have done it to ourselves. That gets to the second version of this question. Is it immoral to have children, knowing how much carbon emissions residents of rich countries are responsible for? This argument recasts not having children as a form of climate reparations. People in rich countries use more resources than people in poor countries. Fewer people means less resource use. Frederick Jameson, the Marxist literary critic, is often credited with the observation that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. A similar limit to our political imaginations lurks in this conversation. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of carbon pollution. Almost all pollution is fixed by the structure of society, says Leah Stokes, a political scientist at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She told Ezra Klein, the goal is to undo that structure so children can be born into a society that is not putting out carbon pollution. That's the project. And it's a doable one. Per capita carbon emissions in the United States fell from more than 22 tons in 1973 to 14 tons in 2020, and it can fall much farther. Germans emitted 7.7 tons of carbon per person in 2020. Swedes emitted 3.8. In a net zero world, nobody has a carbon footprint, and we could stop tabulating guilt by counting babies, Wallace Wells told me. I'm just going to make a brief side comment here. This is just clearly absurd. There's such a cherry picking of various statistics in that comparison to the 70s and our production of carbon emissions and so on. It's not the right place. This is already going to be too long reading of an article to really go into any depth. But I'm reading this whole thing for its absurdity. I'm reading it for its immensely off base and inappropriate attempt at sense making, and to somehow justify the title of this article, that somehow our children will not be suffering the effects of climate change. Somehow to justify that we should be having children in the face of whatever is going on. I'm still not really clear exactly what Ezra Klein's desired point is in this article, but I'm impressed enough at the very, very bad sense making and bad communication of his primary points that I'm obviously inclined to read it. So let me just get on with it and finish it up, and you can make your own choices about how to interpret it. To decarbonize society is to embrace a better world for reasons far beyond climate change. The immediate benefits of climate mitigation actions are spectacular. Better air quality, better health outcomes, reduced inequality. These are words from Kate, again from Kate Marvel. I want these things. I want reforestation and peat bogs and coastal restoration and rewilding. I'm excited about, but not counting on, awesome new tech like cheap carbon removal and nuclear fusion. I'm more excited about boring but effective tech like heat pumps and transmission lines. These are, again, continued words from Kate Marvel in her earlier conversation with Ezra Klein. This is a vision of more, not less. Electric cars are quicker to accelerate. A well-insulated home is warmer. Induction stoves don't fill your home with particulates that are linked to asthma in children and reduced cognitive performance in adults. The wind doesn't stop blowing because an autocrat has a tantrum. Harnessing the solar radiation that bathes our world doesn't leave us in hock to the house of Saud. I don't just prefer a world of net zero emissions to a world of net zero children. I think those worlds are in conflict. I'm going to read those two sentences again because this is an example of what I just don't understand what he's trying to say. I don't just prefer a world of net zero emissions to a world of net zero children. I think those worlds are in conflict. We face a political problem of politics, not a physics problem. The green future has to be a welcoming one, even a thrilling one. If people cannot see themselves in it, they will fight to stop it. If the cost of caring about climate is to forego having a family, that cost will be too high. A climate movement that embraces sacrifice as its answer or even as its temperament might do more harm than good. It may accidentally sacrifice the political appeal needed to make the net zero emissions world real. Worse, it sees young people as passive consumers rather than agents of change. But over the past decade, rising generations have transformed climate politics. Much of the progress we've seen comes from their relentless advocacy and energy. The world they will inhabit is changing because they are changing the world. Again, I would take Ezra Klein to task here. I'm wondering what is his baseline to measure the actual efficacy, the actual effect, the actual agency that is being expressed by these youth advocates that he's talking about. I'm afraid that the actual figures are extraordinarily discouraging in terms of what has actually shifted since COP1 occurred so many years ago. But we continue with Ezra Klein's article. Imagine Greta Thunberg, Stokes said. Her mother was an opera singer. Then she decided to have children. And it turned out one of the children she had became this amazing climate advocate who hopefully will have this huge effect on pollution. Should she not have had her children because some model said kids are bad for the planet? At some point, we're asking whether we believe in the continuation of society and the possibility of young people to be an engine for change. That's again, Leah Stokes in an earlier conversation with Ezra Klein. My children will live a story that I cannot write and cannot control. It will be their story. To become a parent is to feel every day the weight and hope and terror of that fact. I can't tell you whether it's the right choice for you, but no climate model can either. Again, I'm just finishing up with this op-ed piece from Ezra Klein in the New York Times. Its title is "Your Kids Are Not Doomed." And I'm intending on making this a first of a probably roughly 3-part series on god-awful science communication, god-awful climate change communication, and particularly heavily weighted by parents who are also very concerned about the environment and climate change and so on. But you'll hear and see a number of examples of really extraordinarily bad behavior on the part of at least one of these authors, and just god-awful sense-making and god-awful science and environmental concern communication, not to mention parental concern and communication. So it's obvious where I stand. I'm going to be bringing you some examples of these not very effective ways of communicating. And I will hopefully get to some point or two by the end of the series. I'd be very interested to hear your reactions to these episodes here on the Poetry of Predicament podcast. Look forward to reading your comments. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.